History remembers kings and queens for their crowns, their conquests, and sometimes for how ridiculously they died. From drowning in desert to being assassinated by architecture, these aren't noble finales, they're royal fails. In this video, we're diving into 53 of the most bizarre, humiliating, and downright absurd deaths ever to grace a throne. Because when you're royalty, even death can't save you from embarrassment. King Adolf Frederick of Sweden, 1771. Few monarchs in history have managed to eat themselves to death quite so spectacularly as King Adolf Frederick of Sweden. While some kings died on the battlefield and others fell to poison, Adolf Frederick's demise came at the hands of lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, kippers, champagne, and, because he believed in going out with flair, 14 servings of his favourite dessert, semla, a cardamom spice bun stuffed with almond paste and swimming in a bowl of hot milk. That's right. This man perished not with a sword in his hand, but with whipped cream on his lips. Swedes still speak of it with a sort of national pride-tinged embarrassment, as if their king had made the ultimate sacrifice for dessert. He essentially turned dinner into a full-contact sport. Historians call it death by overindulgence. But let's be honest, it's death by pudding. It's the kind of obituary that writes itself. Here lies King Adolf Frederick. He loved pastry too much. Had he lived in the era of Instagram, his final moments might have been live-streamed with #foodieking trending worldwide. And to make things worse, or better, depending on your taste for irony, he's mostly remembered for how he died, not how he ruled. A man who signed edicts and managed national policy is now a trivia answer in a game about deadly desserts. Some legacies are built on greatness, others on gluttony. Adolf chose the latter with a fork in each hand and a stomach full of pride. And if you think dying from dessert is a royal low, wait until you meet the prince who couldn't survive a rice box. Crown Prince Sedo of Korea, 1762. Let's just say that if your dad's idea of parenting involves locking you in a rice chest to die, things at the family dinner table were probably already tense. Crown Prince Sedo, the heir to the Korean throne, had what historians politely call a troubled mind, and what everyone else would describe as deeply, unsettlingly unhinged. He reportedly killed servants at random, stalked the palace with weapons, and once burst into his father's room wearing only his underpants and shouting about dragons. King Yongjo, in a panic, and possibly exhausted by his son's cosplay rampages, ordered that Sedo be sealed inside a large wooden rice chest, not executed, not banished, boxed, like leftovers. It wasn't even a quick death. Sedo survived for 8 agonizing days in the sweltering Korean heat, slowly succumbing to starvation, dehydration, and probably existential rage. When the chest was finally opened, it wasn't a pretty picture. Royal dignity, more like royal containment. And it's not just the death that's embarrassing, it's the logistics. His father essentially gave the palace carpenters a death order and a measuring tape. Build a box big enough for a madman. The end result is one of history's most claustrophobic royal exits, a mix of horror, politics, and really bad parenting. But if you thought being boxed alive was the worst fate for a royal, just wait until you hear about the emperor who ended up as a human footstool. Emperor Valyrian of Rome, 260 AD. Valerian started his reign with ambition, ruling the Roman Empire at a time when barbarians were banging on every marble door. But instead of going out in a blaze of imperial glory, he wound up as a Persian footrest. Yes, a literal human Ottoman, captured by Shapur I of Persia during a disastrous campaign. Emperor Valerian was spared the sword, but only so he could spend the rest of his humiliated life kneeling while Shapur mounted him like a living piece of furniture. And if that weren't enough, legend says things got even worse after Valerian's death. Some accounts claim his skin was flayed, stuffed, and proudly displayed in a Persian temple. Forget golden statues or heroic monuments. This emperor's final form was taxidermy. Rome, the greatest empire in the world, reduced to a leather souvenir. His subjects tried to scrub this from memory, of course. No one wants their history classes ending with, "And then our emperor was turned into a lampshade." But the Persians made sure the message was clear. Rome bows to Persia, literally, with knees. So if you thought dying boxed like a leftover was rough, try being remembered as an imperial beanbag. And still we haven't reached the king who laughed himself to death over a rabbit joke. King Martin of Aragon, 1410. You know the saying, laughter is the best medicine. Well, for King Martin of Aragon, it was also the last thing he ever did. The man quite literally died laughing, giggling himself straight into the afterlife over a joke about a rabbit. Yes, a rabbit. The story goes that while suffering from severe indigestion, because royalty rarely practices moderation, Martin was told a joke about a hunting rabbit that was so fast it could outrun your lies. Apparently Martin found this so hysterical, he laughed uncontrollably until he gasped, wheezed, keeled over, and croaked. Death by punchline is not exactly the kind of thing you want etched on your tomb. But Martin, he went out with a burp and a belly laugh. His court chroniclers had to write that one with a straight face, which might be the real miracle here. And let's not forget the added dignity of the gastrointestinal distress. It wasn't just laughter. It was laughter combined with stomach cramps. His death was like a medieval version of a blooper reel. Now, dying in fits of joy over a fluffy mammal isn't the worst way to go. But it's not exactly regal. No one reads about Alexander the Great and thinks, you know, if only he'd heard a good rabbit joke, maybe we'd have avoided all that empire building. Still, at least Martin had a sense of humour, unlike the next king, who died on a much more literal kind of throne, King George II of Great Britain, 1760. King George II holds the distinguished honour of being the only British monarch known to have died on the toilet. It's not just bathroom humour, it's historical fact. One fine morning in 1760, George II was going about his royal routine when he sat down on his porcelain perch and strained a little too hard. Boom! His heart gave out from an aortic aneurysm. And just like that, His Majesty passed from this world with his trousers around his ankles. The royal physicians tried to dress it up in elegant medical language, but there's no escaping the sheer ignominy of it. The King of Great Britain, defender of the realm, commander-in-chief of the armed forces, was found slumped lifeless on the loo. His death turned the royal bathroom into a crime scene, and the throne into a punchline that has endured for centuries. What's even more awkward? The fact that it probably could have been prevented if he hadn't eaten so much. Again, gluttony and royalty seem to go hand in hand, or fork in mouth. One wonders if his ancestors looked down from the afterlife, sighed, and said, "Not again." At least George didn't go out in a floral massacre like our next star, an emperor with a flair for petals and murder. Emperor Elagabalus of Rome, 222 AD. Ah, Elagabalus. Rome has had its fair share of eccentric emperors, but this guy was in a category of his own. Cross-dressing, scandalously indulgent, and about as subtle as a flaming chariot, Elagabalus was known for turning the Roman Empire into his personal circus. But one of his most infamous party tricks? Trying to suffocate his guests with an avalanche of rose petals. Nothing says hospitality like a floral assassination attempt. But the emperor's penchant for over-the-top theatrics didn't end there. He infuriated the Senate, the military, and pretty much anyone who had a basic grasp of decency. Eventually, his guards decided they'd had enough. They stabbed him to death in a latrine, another classy royal exit, mutilated his body, and then dumped the remains into the Tiber River like yesterday's leftovers. And remember, this was the emperor, the big boss, flushed, sliced, and floral-scented. Even Caligula probably raised an eyebrow in the afterlife. Elagabalus died not just as a political disaster, but as a cautionary tale about what happens when you treat government like burlesque and foreign policy like performance art. But if you think rose petals are dangerous, wait till you meet a queen who drowned, not in perfume or power, but because no one was allowed to touch her. Queen Sandanda Kumariratana of Siam, 1880. Queen Sandanda Kumariratana didn't just die in a boating accident. She died because royal protocol quite literally forbade people from helping her. When her royal barge capsized on the Chao Phraya River, attendants stood helplessly nearby, watching their queen flail and drown, all because it was illegal, yes, illegal, to touch her, even if that touch meant saving her life. Imagine being so divine in the eyes of the court that no one can rescue you from dying. That's next-level royalty. The poor woman was surrounded by loyal guards and servants who probably practiced martial arts and elephant warfare, but couldn't wade into waist-deep water to pull her out. The law was clear. If you lay hands on the queen, you die. So, better let her drown, right? It's the kind of death that turns a royal tragedy into a farce. A supreme example of ritual gone rogue. Even the fish in the river must have been like, really? No one. Her death led to public outrage and eventually to changes in royal custom. But unfortunately, that came a bit late for Queen Sandanda, who got a watery exit in full royal regalia while everyone politely panicked from a distance. And if that wasn't absurd enough, wait until you meet a war-hardened general whose final boss battle was against a flying roof tile. King Pius of Epirus, 272 BC. King Pius of Epirus, yes, the one from Pyrrhic victory fame, was a legendary general, a brilliant tactician, and a man who fought Rome and lived to tell the tale. But after all that, he met his doom during a street fight in Argos, not from a skilled warrior or secret assassin, but from a cranky old woman with good aim and roof access. While Pyrrhus was deep in urban combat, an elderly lady, watching the ruckus from above, decided she'd had enough of the noise and tossed a roof tile down onto the battlefield. Bullseye. The tile struck the great general square on the head, cracking his skull and toppling him from his horse. A soldier finished the job, but the hard part had already been done, by a flying piece of terracotta. The man who once fought battles so brutal they coined a term for hollow victories. Taken out by Granny's home improvement project. It's as if Julius Caesar got shanked by a loose floorboard. Pyrrhus's end was so embarrassingly domestic that it feels like satire. It's proof that no matter how many empires you fight, you're always one roof tile away from irrelevance. But even that pales in comparison to our next king, who was brought down not by armies, not by revolts, but by a monkey, King Alexander of Greece, 1920. Alexander of Greece didn't die in war, nor was he taken out by political rivals. No, this unfortunate monarch met his end thanks to a monkey, specifically a pet monkey owned by a palace staff member. The story goes like this. Alexander was out walking in the garden when one monkey got into a scuffle with his dog. Trying to break up the furry brawl, Alexander was bitten, not once, but several times, by the furious simian. Now, in the modern world, you'd get a rabies shot and a story for late-night talk shows. But in 1920, not so much. His wounds became infected, sepsis set in, and within a few weeks, the king of Greece was dead from a monkey bite. It sounds like the plot of a bad comedy movie, but it's history. Real, certified, monkey-fueled history. And the aftermath? Greece spiraled into political chaos. Monarchists and republicans clashed. The king's death arguably changed the course of the entire nation, all because of a monkey tantrum. Forget Game of Thrones. This is Game of Throwing Bananas. And if you think monkey bites are a strange royal exit, brace yourself for an emperor who tried, and hilariously failed, to hang himself, multiple times. Emperor Chongjen of Ming China, 1644. If you're going to end your own life as a last act of dignity before your empire collapses, you'd probably hope to do it swiftly and gracefully. Not Emperor Chongjen. As rebel forces stormed Beijing and centuries of Ming rule came crashing down, Chongjen decided to avoid capture by hanging himself in the palace garden. Noble, perhaps, but he was very, very bad at it. He first tried in the palace. Didn't work. Tried again in another location. Still didn't work. Eventually, he made it out to a tree on Coal Hill behind the Forbidden City. There, the last emperor of the Ming dynasty finally succeeded after multiple failed attempts and much scrambling through shrubbery. Let's just say that when your suicide takes several tries and some landscaping, the whole dignified final act thing goes out the window. Adding to the awkwardness, he left a dramatic note on his robe, blaming traitorous ministers and begging not to be mutilated post-mortem. But honestly, history had already done the mutilation for his pride. His body was later discovered by palace staff, dangling unceremoniously, ending a dynasty not with a bang, but with tangled robes and tree bark. And speaking of royalty being undone by the incompetence of others, or themselves, our next Tsar didn't even get a chance to be rescued. Sar Ivan VI of Russia, 1764. Ivan VI had the rare distinction of being imprisoned for almost his entire life, crowned as a baby, and then deposed before he could form full sentences. By the time he was a young man, he was a ghost of a monarch, locked away in solitary confinement with guards who knew only one thing. If anyone ever tried to free him, they were to kill him immediately. So when a young officer named Vasily Mirovich attempted a daring rescue in 1764, the guards followed instructions like terrifyingly efficient robots. Before Mirovich could even shout, "Long live the Tsar," Ivan was dead, stabbed, slashed, and done away with like spoiled cabbage. What makes it particularly grim is that Ivan had no say in any of it. He didn't rule. He didn't rebel. He just existed, inconveniently, as a royal placeholder. And when someone finally thought, "Hey, maybe we give this guy a life," the plan was shut down with military precision and zero hesitation. Ivan's entire legacy boils down to being a tragic footnote, a ruler who ruled nothing, and died because someone followed orders too well. He's the human version of Do Not Disturb taken to a fatal extreme. But if you think that's a bleak way to go, let's take a stroll into the bizarre, starting with a king who lost his life not in war, not by betrayal, but by walking into a doorframe. King Charles VIII of France, 1498. Charles VIII's death is the historical equivalent of stubbing your toe and never recovering. While strolling through his chateau, likely deep in thought about warfare or Renaissance architecture, he failed to notice a very low doorway. He smashed his head so hard on the stone lintel that he collapsed immediately. Although he managed to hang on for a few hours, the damage was done. The king was slain by masonry. Let's take a moment to appreciate this. The King of France, conqueror of Naples, the man who dreamed of a pan-European empire, met his maker thanks to bad spatial awareness and poor ceiling clearance. It's like Napoleon tripping on a Lego brick, and it gets better, or worse, depending on how dark your humor runs. After he fell, he reportedly had a seizure and never regained consciousness. Meanwhile, the court probably whispered furiously about whether they should lower the rest of the doors or just pad the king's head in the future. Too late. No enemy swords, no poisoning plots, just a fatal bonk. His epitaph should have read, "Here lies Charles, taken down by domestic architecture." But before you pity Charles too much, consider Prince Arthur, whose death came courtesy of something far less noble than stone, and much more damp, Prince Arthur of the UK, 1502. Before there was Henry VIII and his marital demolition derby, there was his older brother, Prince Arthur, the original Tudor golden boy, groomed to inherit the throne, married off to the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon, and the centre of royal dreams for a unified Europe, until a fateful honeymoon turned him into one of England's soggiest tragedies. Shortly after marrying Catherine, Arthur fell violently ill with sweating sickness, a mysterious and terrifying Tudor plague that could kill you in hours. Some historians suspect the honeymoon suite itself was to blame, damp, poorly ventilated, and crawling with the sort of Tudor hygiene standards that make a gas station restroom look like a spa. Others think he caught it from mingling with the sweaty masses of Ludlow, where he'd been sent to rule over Wales. Either way, he sweated, he shivered, and he expired. The most embarrassing part, the death left behind all the awkwardness of an unconsummated marriage. Catherine would later swear under oath that her union with Arthur was never completed, a detail that became extremely relevant when she went on to marry Henry VIII and needed papal approval to keep things kosher. The whole thing turned Arthur's memory into less of a legacy and more of a legal obstacle. Arthur's royal death left a void, and a little brother who'd grow up with way too much power and far too many wives. But if you think dying of a sweaty honeymoon is awkward, wait until you hear about the emperor who literally got startled to death by a ritual. Emperor Jing of Han, 141 BC. If there's a hall of fame for ridiculous royal deaths caused by protocol, Emperor Jing of Han deserves a golden plaque. He didn't die in battle, nor by poison, nor by palace intrigue. No, he was killed by a ritual. Specifically, he suffered a minor injury during a ceremonial rite that went slightly off script. A startled horse, a sudden jolt, and boom. The emperor was injured badly enough to spiral into death. Details are vague because court historians were understandably embarrassed. After all, this was the Son of Heaven, ruler of a massive empire, undone by something that sounds like a clumsy opening act at a royal festival. You can almost imagine the confused silence after the incident, followed by a lot of court officials pretending it wasn't their fault. It's like if the President of the United States died from tripping over a podium ribbon during a ribbon-cutting ceremony. It would be tragic, yes, but also deeply awkward. Emperor Jing's legacy is mostly remembered for reform and restraint, but it's hard to compete with "died of ritual gone wrong" as a historical soundbite. Still, he gets points for originality. And speaking of uncomfortable endings caused by poor planning, let's turn to a king who thought peaches were a good idea during a plague. King John of England, 1216. King John, reviled tyrant, signer of the Magna Carta, inspiration for every villainous prince in every Robin Hood story, ever, and the man who died of dysentery after gorging himself on peaches. Truly, a fitting end for England's least beloved monarch. By 1216, things were already going downhill. Civil war, a rebellion backed by the French, and public opinion polls in the toilet, if they had toilets. So, naturally, while travelling with his army and desperately trying to hold on to his crumbling kingdom, John stumbled upon a stash of ripe peaches. And he didn't eat one or two. He ate a surfeit, an old-fashioned way of saying a ridiculous, possibly suicidal amount. Combine that with unclean water, medieval hygiene, and battlefield stress, and John's digestive system waved the white flag. He died soon after, shriveled and leaking, somewhere between a royal tent and a latrine trench. And let's not sugarcoat it. Dysentery isn't a glamorous death. It's violent, humiliating, and the kind of thing you don't want sung about by bards. Yet somehow, it feels almost poetic. The king who taxed everyone into misery, lost Normandy, and backstabbed his own nobles, taken down by fruit and a bad stomach. And if you think a peach-induced poop-ocalypse is embarrassing, just wait until you meet the king who literally got crushed by his own throne. King Bela Wen of Hungary, 1063. When you think of symbolic royal deaths, King Bela I of Hungary takes the crown right before being crushed by it. In 1063, Bela, who had spent years battling rivals and cementing his authority, finally claimed the throne. Unfortunately, the throne had other plans. In a moment, so poetic it could have been staged by Shakespeare with a cruel sense of slapstick, Bela sat down, and the royal seat collapsed beneath him, fatally. Yes. The throne, literal and metaphorical, crushed the king. It's as if fate, irony, and carpentry all joined forces to say, "Not today, Your Majesty." 1 second, he's asserting dominance. The next, he's sprawled on the floor with royal dignity in pieces and the furniture responsible for regicide. It wasn't even during a dramatic event or major battle. Just an ordinary day with extraordinary bad luck and even worse construction. This death had everything: absurdity, symbolism, and likely a very nervous court carpenter who quietly vanished after the incident. Some historians debate whether it was the fall that killed him or injuries sustained from the collapse, but that's splitting hairs. The point is, a king died because his own royal butt broke the seat of power. And if you think that's awkward, the next guy didn't even have time to sit down properly before death came knocking. From underneath, King Edmund Ironside of England, 1016. King Edmund Ironside. Just the name screams medieval toughness. He fought tooth and nail against Danish invaders, nearly held England together during one of its most chaotic times, and died in a way that can only be described as deeply medieval and horrifyingly creative. According to some rather graphic legends, Edmund was assassinated while using the toilet. Not after, not before, during. The assassin, allegedly hiding in a pit beneath the royal privy, waited for the king to take his throne, so to speak, and then rammed a sharp weapon, possibly a spear, upward through the hole. Surprise! Whether or not this is entirely accurate, we may never know, but let's be honest. It's one of those stories that's too grotesque not to be remembered. Scholars have debated the truth of it for centuries, and no one wants to be the historian that has to write anus assassination into an official record. But someone did. Possibly with a straight face. It's one of the ultimate medieval Game of Thrones moments, literally and figuratively. Edmund Ironside, warrior king, national defender, toilet victim. History is cruel, but for true royal tragedy, nothing hits quite like the image of a 6-year-old emperor being carried into the sea by his grandmother as an entire dynasty drowned with him. Emperor Antaku of Japan, 1185. The final days of the Heike clan were cinematic in their grandeur and heartbreaking in their absurdity. At just 6 years old, Emperor Antaku was already the symbolic head of a collapsing regime. As the naval battle of Dan no Ura raged around him, his family, realizing all was lost, chose a dramatic and haunting end in what might be the most tragic version of "If I go down, you're coming with me." Antaku's grandmother scooped him up and leapt into the sea, dragging the child emperor and the imperial regalia with her to the ocean floor. She was determined to prevent the boy from falling into enemy hands. Dignified. Perhaps. Logical? Debatable. Fatal. Absolutely. The imperial crown, the sacred mirror, the sword, all went under. Japan's legendary regalia was now somewhere in the deep, bobbing around with the ghosts of a drowned dynasty and a very confused toddler emperor. Antaku never ruled in any real capacity, never made a decision, never got to play in the garden without armed guards. And yet he died like a Shakespearean character, draped in silk, carried into myth by an elderly woman convinced that death was better than dishonor. It's hard to top such epic melodrama. But if you think royal drownings are strange, let's check in on the king who vanished in battle and left an entire nation wondering if he just walked off. King Sebastian of Portugal, 1578. Sebastian of Portugal wasn't just a king. He was a teenage crusader with a messiah complex and a flair for bad decisions. At 24, with no wife, no heir, and no chill, he charged off to Morocco to fight in a holy war that no one really asked for. His advisors begged him not to go. His nobles hesitated. But Sebastian wanted glory, so off he went. Bright armor, dramatic speeches, and all the strategic foresight of a wet sandwich. Then came the Battle of Alcácer Quibir, where the Portuguese forces were absolutely annihilated. But here's the kicker. Sebastian disappeared, completely. No body, no horse, no crown, nothing. Just gone. Some say he died in the chaos, others claimed he wandered into the desert. His army? They were too busy dying or running to keep track of their glow-in-the-dark monarch. The embarrassment wasn't just personal, it was national. Portugal entered a succession crisis, eventually fell under Spanish rule, and sparked centuries of conspiracy theories. Some claimed Sebastian would return, like a royal Bigfoot, to reclaim his throne. The Sebastianist movement clung to this hope, like a drunken uncle, insisting Elvis is alive. To this day, there are folks who think he's out there. Spoiler, he's not. But thanks to one very bad vacation, Portugal lost a king, a battle, and its independence. And all because young Sebastian wanted to play desert hero without a return flight. And if you think disappearing into the sand is a strange way to go, the next king managed to die by turning himself into a flambéed cocktail. King Charles II of Navarre, 1387. Charles II of Navarre, also known as Charles the Bad, because medieval subtlety was not a thing, earned his nickname with a career full of treachery, scheming, and casual betrayal. But it wasn't poison or politics that did him in. No, Charles met his end in the most ironic way imaginable, while trying to get better. Sick and desperate for a cure, his doctors decided on a classic 14th century medical treatment. Wrap the king in cloth, soaked in brandy. Why? Because nothing says healing like being mummified in liquor. Once tightly bound and marinated, the treatment was supposed to warm his body and draw out the sickness. Then a servant came in with a candle. You can imagine what happened next. One stray flame, a whoosh, and suddenly Charles was less recovering monarch and more royal inferno. He burned to death in bed, wrapped like a fire hazard from a cooking show. The servant reportedly panicked and fled, and Charles died screaming, probably realizing that branding himself the Bad had finally come full circle. You live by the scandal. You die by the flambé. And speaking of royal appearances being dangerous, meet the Empress whose fabulous hair got caught in palace machinery. Spoiler, it didn't end well. Empress Dugu of Northern Zhou, 558. In a palace world where appearances were everything and courtly elegance was survival, Empress Dugu stood out, graceful, intelligent, and politically savvy. But even she couldn't escape the ultimate betrayal, her own hairstyle. Legend has it that while walking through the palace, her magnificent hair, undoubtedly the result of hours of primping and pinning, got caught in some sort of moving palace contraption. Maybe a ceremonial lift, a rotating platform, or some unnecessarily complex early form of HVAC system. Whatever it was, it grabbed her by the locks and refused to let go. She was either strangled, slammed, or torn, depending on which version you believe. But either way, it was death by coiffure. Forget poison, forget daggers. Empress Dugu went down because her hair was too fabulous for the architecture to handle. This was more than just a tragic end. It was a style statement turned fatal. History has a few hair-related fatalities, but few can match the sheer mechanical absurdity of this one.
It's the kind of death that makes you want to shout, "Why is there even a machine near her head?"
And if you think being scalped by the palace decor is grim, just wait until we talk about the king who died because he couldn't resist forbidden fish. King Henry I of England, 1135. King Henry I, son of William the Conqueror, ruled with a firm hand and a suspicious fondness for weird food. A shrewd politician, ruthless ruler, and tireless administrator, he brought peace to England, then promptly got murdered by his dinner plate. Or, more accurately, by a pile of slippery, slimy, horrifyingly toothy creatures called lampreys. Lampreys look like the unholy offspring of a leech and an eel, and Henry loved them like they were foie gras. His doctors begged him not to eat too many. "They're bad for your digestion, Your Majesty," they said. "Don't do it, sire," they pleaded. And Henry, being king, replied with the medieval equivalent of YOLO, and devoured an enormous amount of the wriggling delicacy anyway. The result: massive indigestion, fever, and death by eel. Or to be precise, a surfeit of lampreys. That phrase alone has haunted royal trivia books ever since. Not assassinated, not died in battle, but over-lampreyed. That's his legacy. The man who brought stability to England after decades of war, remembered for dying like a medieval contestant on Fear Factor. And as absurd as that is, at least he didn't fall off a cliff, because he wanted to prove he still had it at 58. King Albert I of Belgium, 1934. King Albert I of Belgium was a hero of World War I, a national symbol of courage, and a man who thought ropes were optional. In 1934, at the age of 58, Albert decided to go mountain climbing, alone, unroped and unsupervised. Because what could possibly go wrong when the head of state free solos a cliff? Spoiler, gravity happened. Despite being beloved by his people and having access to literally any guide, rope or common sense, Albert went climbing in the Ardennes, slipped, and fell to his death. A tragic end made more frustrating by how preventable it was. There was no political conspiracy, no war, no treachery, just a monarch playing Spider-Man and losing. It was so abrupt and so ridiculous that some Belgians refused to believe it. Rumours swirled for years that he'd been assassinated, pushed, or abducted by aliens. But the truth was far simpler. He underestimated a rock and overestimated his knees. Still, there's something noble in dying doing what you love. Unless, of course, what you love is using the enemy's weapon to shoot yourself in front of them. Emperor Teedros II of Ethiopia, 1868. Emperor Teedros II had a flair for drama and a deep dislike for British interference. So when a British expedition stormed his mountain fortress at Magdala in 1868, Teedros decided he wouldn't give them the satisfaction of capturing him alive. That's already a pretty theatrical choice, but it gets better or worse depending on how much you appreciate imperial irony. Instead of using a traditional sword, poison, or even a local firearm, Teedros pulled out a British-made pistol, a gift no less, and shot himself in the head. Imagine being so committed to sticking it to your enemies that you use their own present to exit the story. He died on the spot, surrounded by the chaos of a collapsing empire, British troops closing in, and the kind of silence that follows an act so bold and ridiculous it defies commentary. His death ended the campaign instantly. The British had no one left to capture. The enemy had literally removed himself from the board. The symbolism was clear. Teedros's last act was to say, "You win, but only because I let you." Unfortunately, it also meant Ethiopia lost its emperor to equal parts pride and theatrical timing. But if you think that's ironic, wait until you meet the king who was shot in the head, and we're still not sure if it was his enemies or his friends. King Charles XII of Sweden, 1718. Charles XII of Sweden was a warrior king in every sense. Stoic, bold, and allergic to peacetime. He spent most of his reign at war, often wearing the same tattered uniform for years and sleeping with one eye open. Nicknamed the Lion of the North, he charged into battle after battle, mostly fueled by icy determination and whatever meat they could find in Norway. But all that martial glory came to an abrupt and very murky end when Charles was shot in the head during the siege of Frederick's fortress. Now here's where things get embarrassing. To this day, no one knows who fired the fatal bullet. Was it a Norwegian defender? A sniper hiding in the mist? Or was it one of his own fed-up soldiers, tired of endless wars and the king's complete refusal to quit? The debate has lasted for centuries, with historians, conspiracy theorists, and fans of Swedish true crime all weighing in. One version says the shot came from the enemy, another insists it came from behind, and some accounts suggest the bullet entered his temple in such a neat straight path that it could only have come from close range. Oops. If true, it would mean Charles wasn't just a casualty of war. He was a victim of a military group project gone rogue. Either way, the mighty Lion of the North died mid-siege, helmet pierced, expression reportedly serene, perhaps because he finally got to stop fighting. But if getting assassinated possibly by your own army feels like betrayal, wait until you hear about the king who died from chasing tail. Literally, King Louis III of France, 882. King Louis III didn't have a long reign, but he sure had a memorable exit. At just 18 years old, he was riding high, young, powerful, and clearly lacking the voice of a responsible adult in his life. One day, while inside a royal estate, Louis spotted a beautiful girl and decided to impress her with the medieval equivalent of "Hey baby" by chasing her on horseback, indoors. This royal Romeo galloped through the halls at full speed, either to flirt or frighten. History isn't clear, but what is clear is the lintel. A nice, solid piece of architectural design that did not appreciate being headbutted by a full-grown king at top speed. Louis smacked into it with such force that he was knocked unconscious and died not long after. The girl presumably escaped unharmed and with an amazing story for her future grandchildren. The King of France once chased me through a hallway and brained himself on a doorway, which is romantic in the most horrifying way. No battle, no assassination, just a low ceiling and poor impulse control. And if that sounds bad, just wait until you hear about the prince who died because someone couldn't heat the bath water correctly. Prince Louis II of Condé, 1686. If you ever feared taking a bath could kill you, Prince Louis II of Condé is here to validate your paranoia. This French nobleman, war hero and cousin to the king, died not from a sword wound, a political scandal, or even the plague, but from complications following a lukewarm bath. The bath was meant to soothe his aches. The water, however, wasn't heated properly. It was too cold, or too hot, or just too badly prepared. And instead of a relaxing soak, he emerged ill. The details vary depending on which 17th century drama queen wrote the account, but all agree. This was a death caused by bathing gone wrong. Doctors tried leeching, bleeding, and possibly some well-intentioned mumbling in Latin. Nothing worked. Louis succumbed to the post-bath fever, his body offended by the temperature, and his dignity ruined by the fact that future generations would remember him as the guy who died from sitting wrong in a fancy tub. It's a royal death that screams, never trust the help with your spa routine. But if you think bubble baths are lethal, wait until you hear about a Tsar who met his end via golden snuff box. Because yes, that happened. Emperor Paul III of Russia, 1801. If there's one thing Russian emperors have taught us, it's that being Tsar is a dangerous gig. But Emperor Paul III takes the imperial cake when it comes to bizarre exits. Hated by the nobility, distrusted by his own family, and so paranoid he literally had secret tunnels built under his palace, Paul was a walking, sash-wearing invitation to regicide. And sure enough, in 1801, a group of conspirators decided they'd had enough of his erratic behavior and micromanaging madness. They stormed his bedroom one night with the intention of forcing his abdication. But things escalated rapidly. Words were exchanged. A struggle broke out. And someone, no one's exactly sure who, grabbed the nearest available object and beat the Tsar to death with it. That object? A golden snuff box. Yes. The Emperor of all the Russias was bludgeoned with a bejeweled container for powdered tobacco. 1 minute it's a luxurious accessory, the next it's a blunt instrument of regicide. It was a murder both elegant and deranged. You have to admire the style. If you're going to assassinate an emperor, why not do it with the same item he uses to season his nose? The aftermath was just as dramatic. His son, Alexander I, who may or may not have known about the plot, took the throne while everyone pretended the whole thing had been very unfortunate and absolutely not a glittery conspiracy. And while Paul's death was brutal and blingy, it still doesn't beat the awkwardness of a modern king found shot in bed with no one able to explain what happened. King Anander Mahedol of Thailand, 1946. King Anander Mahedol was young, gentle, and not at all the kind of monarch you'd expect to become the center of one of the 20th century's greatest royal mysteries. At just 20 years old, he was found dead in his bedroom at the royal palace in Bangkok, shot through the head. A modern king, in a modern world, killed in a way more suited to a detective novel than a constitutional monarchy. Immediately, theories exploded like fireworks at a coronation. Was it an accident? Suicide? Cold-blooded murder? Some said he was cleaning his pistol. Others whispered about palace politics. A few pointed fingers at his own brother, Bhumibol, who would later become Thailand's longest reigning monarch. The only thing everyone agreed on? It was uncomfortable. No one likes a royal whodunit. An investigation was launched. Then another. Then another. They arrested people, blamed conspirators, executed scapegoats. But no explanation ever really stuck. The case remains officially closed, but the truth is still floating somewhere between a tragic accident and a political cover-up. One thing's for sure. Being a king and waking up dead in your own bed is about as suspicious as it gets. And speaking of suspicious, next we have a king who didn't get shot, didn't get bludgeoned, but was stabbed to death in a church by a guy angry about cancelled wedding plans. King Phillip of Swabia, 1208. Weddings are supposed to be joyful, unless, of course, you're King Philip of Swabia and you cancel the wrong one. In 1208, Philip was trying to smooth over his very rocky reign as the disputed king of the Germans, and nothing says diplomacy like marrying off your daughters. One such political engagement involved Count Otto of Wittelsbach. But at some point, Philip decided Otto wasn't good enough for the family and broke off the engagement. Bad move. Otto, proving that 13th century nobles weren't great at handling rejection, took it personally. Very personally. He showed up to a church in Bamberg where Philip was preparing for a royal event, got close under the pretense of delivering news, then whipped out a dagger and stabbed the king in front of horrified clergy. Let that sink in. Assassinated in a church because of romantic rejection. Philip's last thoughts might well have been, really? Over a wedding? To add insult to injury, his body was so poorly guarded after the attack that people had time to loot his rings and robe. He lost his throne, his dignity, and his wardrobe all in one day. But if you think dying because of bad matchmaking is brutal, brace yourself for the caliph who was rolled into a carpet and trampled to death by horses, all to keep his blood off the floor. King al-Mustasim of Baghdad, 1258. When the Mongols come knocking, it's usually not for a friendly chat. And King al-Mustasim of Baghdad found that out the hard way, then the soft way, then the trampled way. In 1258, when Hulagu Khan's Mongol horde descended upon Baghdad, the caliph, in all his royal wisdom, decided to respond with arrogance, a half-baked defense strategy, and some very misplaced confidence in his city walls. The Mongols weren't impressed. They destroyed the city, burned libraries, and reportedly turned the Tigris River black with ink and red with blood. As for al-Mustasim, Hulagu had a poetic flair for execution. Since spilling royal blood was frowned upon in Mongol tradition, they decided to kill the caliph without breaking that rule. So they rolled him up in a carpet and let the horses do the rest. Yes, Baghdad's ruler, once surrounded by jewels, scholars, and silk, ended his days being steamrolled like a Persian rug at a polo match. There's something uniquely mortifying about being both symbolically and literally flattened out of existence. No sword, no fanfare, just the rhythmic thud of hooves and the smell of upholstery. History remembers al-Mustasim less for his rule and more for his unique transformation into a one-man welcome mat. But at least his death had, shall we say, structure. Unlike the king who decided praying in a heat wave was a great idea, King Sancho I of Majorca, 1324. There are many noble ways to die in a chapel: martyrdom, sacred sacrifice, maybe even dramatic exorcism. But King Sancho I of Majorca, he died from being too holy for too long. During a sweltering Mediterranean heatwave, Sancho decided that intense, prolonged prayer in a tiny, poorly ventilated chapel was the perfect spiritual workout. Hours passed. The temperature soared. Sancho refused to leave. Because, God might get offended if he broke for water. Eventually, the heat overwhelmed him. The king collapsed mid-devotion, his prayers unanswered by air conditioning or common sense. The diagnosis? Heat stroke, dehydration, and a lethal overdose of piety. It's the sort of death that sounds like a Monty Python sketch. His court must have been horrified, but also quietly asking, why didn't anyone crack a window? His epitaph should have read, died doing what he loved, ignoring basic thermoregulation.
Sancho's story is a cautionary tale in overachieving religious enthusiasm. Prayer is powerful, but hydration is non-negotiable.
And speaking of cautionary tales, wait until you hear about the king who was about to be beheaded. Except his executioner forgot the one thing every good beheading needs. King Archil of Iberia, 8th century. Archil of Iberia was a noble man. Stubborn, yes, but noble. When the conquering forces offered him a deal, convert to Islam or die, Archil chose door number 2. This bold defiance meant execution, the kind of death that history remembers with stoic reverence. Except, it didn't go smoothly. The executioner, bless him, showed up to do his very sacred, very serious duty, only to realize he'd forgotten something kind of essential. The sword. You had one job. One job. So there Archil stood, prepared to meet his fate, only for the scene to grind to a halt like a stage play missing its props. Picture it. The awkward silence, the rustling of robes, maybe a few muffled coughs, as the executioner sheepishly looked around and muttered, "Anyone got a blade I can borrow?" Eventually, a sword was fetched, and the deed was done. But the moment, what should have been a dignified execution, well, relatively speaking, turned into a flustered mess of borrowed weaponry and second-hand doom. Archil died a martyr, yes, but also as the footnote in every worst day at work story ever told by ancient executioners. And if you think that's clumsy, just wait until we get to the king who was allegedly assassinated with pea soup, King Eric XIV of Sweden, 1577. Ah, King Eric XIV, a man whose reign was so turbulent, so paranoid, and so sprinkled with mental breakdowns that his death by pea soup almost seems poetic. After being deposed by his half-brother and imprisoned, Eric spent his final years languishing in a lonely Swedish castle, which, let's be honest, is never a great setup for a happy ending. But the real drama came at dinner time. One day, he was served his usual meal, hearty Swedish fare, including his favourite, pea soup. Comfort food, you'd think. But shortly after slurping it down, he fell violently ill and died. Historians suspect it was poisoned. Arsenic? Mercury? Oversalted passive aggression? Nobody knows for sure. But one thing's clear. This wasn't just soup. It was murder broth. And let's not ignore the symbolism here. A former king, once dressed in velvet and gold, brought low by a bowl of mushy legumes. His enemies didn't need swords or daggers, just a ladle. The phrase death by soup doesn't exactly scream power and legacy, but it does say, maybe don't trust your lunch if you're on the royal hit list. Still, Eric went out in true Swedish fashion, quiet, awkward, and slightly green. And while pea soup is a sneaky killer, Emperor Modi of Jyn went for the full dramatic escape plan and failed miserably. Emperor Modi of Jyn, 1234. Imagine ruling a crumbling empire, knowing the Mongols are at the gates and your dynasty's days are numbered. Now imagine thinking, you know what'll fix this? Disguise and improv theatre. That's exactly what Emperor Modi of Jyn tried when Kai Phong fell to the Mongols. Realizing the gig was up, he threw on peasant clothes, slathered on some desperation, and tried to blend into the chaos like a rogue extra in a disaster film. Spoiler, he did not blend. Maybe it was the soft imperial hands. Maybe it was the trembling, commoner voice. Or maybe it was the fact that no normal farmer wears silk underwear. Whatever the giveaway, the Mongols spotted him, dragged him out of the crowd, and executed him on the spot. So much for stealth mode. It's one of those royal deaths that seems tragic, until you realize it's also a little slapstick. The emperor, master of a once great dynasty, taken down not by armies or assassins, but by a bad costume and worse acting. He died not with a crown, but with straw stuck to his face and his legacy slipping between his fingers like sand through silk. Still, if you think that's a painful ending, just wait until we visit the king who died because a wooden stick decided to explore his eyeball, King Henry II of France, 1559. You'd think kings would know better than to joust without a helmet visor, but Henry II of France wasn't one for cautious living. In 1559, during a grand tournament celebrating his daughter's wedding, Henry decided to joust for fun. And by fun, we mean dangerous sport, where grown men stab each other with tree trunks. Henry's opponent, Gabriel de Montgomery, a handsome nobleman who probably didn't expect to go down in history for accidentally impaling the king. During their final charge, Montgomery's lance shattered on impact. A splintered shard flew straight through Henry's open visor and into his eye, traveling deep into his brain. Did he die immediately? Oh no. He lingered for 10 agonizing days, moaning in pain, surrounded by surgeons frantically trying medieval neurosurgery, aka poking and praying. Catherine de' Medici, his famously ruthless wife, reportedly watched helplessly, perhaps wondering if her horoscope had warned her about this. Henry's death put an end to jousting in France, for obvious reasons. It turns out no one wants to risk a royal kebab at the next wedding bash. And Montgomery? He fled the scene, knowing full well that no good ever comes from accidentally murdering a king. But if you think splinters are deadly, just wait until you hear about the king who got murdered in bed. while in bed, with someone else's someone, King Wenceslaus III of Bohemia, 1306. Wenceslaus III had a lot going for him. He was young, rich, and technically king of 3 different realms, Bohemia, Hungary, and Poland. But none of that protected him from the classic royal weakness, scandalous bedroom decisions. In 1306, while staying in Olomouc, Moravia, the 16-year-old monarch was murdered in his chambers, unarmed, unclothed, and, as whispered by history with a raised eyebrow, in bed with someone who very much wasn't supposed to be there. The identity of the mystery bedmate remains unconfirmed. Some say a male companion, others suggest a woman of ill repute, and one theory even goes for a disguised assassin. But what's certain is that Wenceslaus was caught completely off guard. Assassins burst into the room and stabbed him to death before he could so much as grab a royal robe. His body was found with multiple wounds and no witnesses willing to speak up, either out of fear or extreme embarrassment. The assassination remains unsolved. Was it political? Romantic? A jealous rival with a vendetta and very sharp timing? Who knows? But it certainly marked a humiliating full stop for the Przemyslid dynasty. 3 crowns, 0 heirs, and one final scandal that made palace gossip columnists of the 14th century drool into their parchment. And while Wenceslaus's death was surrounded by secrecy and suspicion, the next emperor's death was more open and heartbreakingly poetic. Emperor I of Han, 1 BC. Emperor I wasn't a warlord, a tyrant, or even particularly effective as a ruler, but he was deeply in love with a man named Dong Xian. Their relationship was famous enough in ancient China to give rise to the phrase, the cut sleeve, referencing the time Emperor Ai sliced off his own sleeve, rather than disturb Dong, who had fallen asleep on it. Talk about tender. Of course, Confucian society wasn't thrilled. Courtiers whispered. Scholars clutched their scrolls. And when Emperor Ai's health declined, political pressure mounted to remove Dong Xian from power. Eventually, under enormous pressure and possibly hallucinating from illness, Emperor Ai was forced to exile his lover. He reportedly never recovered from the heartbreak. Soon after, in 1 BC, the emperor died, at the ripe old age of 25. The official cause? Illness. The unofficial cause? A shattered spirit. The man who once ruled the Han Empire went out not in war, not in scandal, but in romantic despair. Historians tiptoe around this part of his reign like it's a broken vase they don't want to discuss too loudly. But make no mistake, Emperor Ai died because he loved someone in the wrong century. And while Ai's death was emotional, King Zhongzhou of Joseon went out in a blaze of, well, pharmaceutical miscalculation. King Zhongzhou of Joseon, 1800. King Zhongzhou of Joseon was a reformer, a scholar, and a micromanager's dream. He worked tirelessly to modernize Korea's bureaucracy, protect his royal lineage, and improve the state of the nation. Unfortunately, he also had what court physicians described as a delicate constitution, which is royal code for his immune system was a drama queen. To combat this, Zhongzhou took medicine, a lot of medicine. Tinctures, powders, mysterious roots, exotic herbs shipped in from every direction, and in doses that would make a modern pharmacist break into a cold sweat. Despite having royal doctors and an army of apothecaries, no one thought to say, "Maybe not all the pills, Your Majesty." In the sweltering summer of 1800, Zhongzhou began to suffer from fever and digestive issues, probably worsened by his royal medicine cabinet. He doubled down on his regimen. More ginseng, more deer antler, more whatever powdered thing they thought worked that week. He died shortly after, leaving behind reforms, a confused court, and one very well-stocked royal infirmary. It's the ancient version of taking 50 vitamins and wondering why your kidneys revolt. Zhongzhou's legacy lives on, but it's hard not to imagine the real cause of death being an overdose of well-intentioned nonsense. But if you thought overdosing on ancient supplements was extreme, just wait until we take a long, cold boat ride with the king who died because sea travel turned out to be a royal disaster. King Håkon V of Norway, 1319. For a man who spent his life building fortresses and unifying Norway, King Håkon V died in the least cinematic way imaginable, slowly freezing and coughing himself to death on a boat. No battles, no assassinations, no thrilling last words, just a long, wet, miserable sea journey, and the creeping realization that his royal lungs were not built for Scandinavian maritime endurance. The voyage was meant to be a routine inspection of his coastal territories. But Håkon, already in poor health, found himself battered by waves, chilled to the bone, and likely regretting every fish-based meal on board. The court physicians did what medieval court physicians always did, offered terrible advice and prayed a lot. Spoiler, it didn't help. Eventually, somewhere between mild chills and "Why is the king turning blue?" Håkon succumbed to illness and exhaustion. He died as he lived, stoic, determined, and too stubborn to admit that sea travel in a Norwegian winter was a bad idea. His death left Norway in political limbo and probably taught future monarchs an important lesson. If you're going to rule from the fjords, maybe invest in a decent blanket and don't board a ship when you're already coughing up a lung. But if a slow-motion death by cold water wasn't embarrassing enough, try leading a failed rebellion, getting exiled for life, and having your enemies call you a cosmic joke. Emperor Go-Toba of Japan, 1239. Emperor Go-Toba had big dreams. Unfortunately, none of them involved actual competence. After being forced to abdicate as a teenager, Go-Toba spent decades simmering in the background of Japanese politics, nurturing grand ambitions and writing mediocre poetry. Eventually, he decided to stop brooding and start rebelling. Thus began the Jokyu War, where Go-Toba, now in his 40s and convinced he was basically a divine military genius, led a laughably underprepared uprising against the Kamakura shogunate. It lasted 3 months. The shogunate crushed him like a bug under a ceremonial sandal. His punishment? Exile to a remote island, cut off from politics, poetry contests, and pretty much everything except tide schedules. There, he lived out the rest of his days in quiet humiliation, surrounded by disgraced followers and the constant reminder that no one took his divinity seriously. He died in 1239, not on a battlefield, not in a blaze of glory, but probably in a drafty hut wondering how the gods could be so rude. His supporters tried to spin it as a noble end. The rest of Japan called it what it was, a royal temper tantrum with a long time out. Still, Go-Toba had at least a little peace in his final years. Unlike our next royal, who tried to die in dignity and instead got turned into a family dinner argument, King Mindon Min of Burma, 1878. King Mindon Min was a thoughtful and relatively peaceful ruler, qualities that, historically speaking, are a great way to ensure your court is full of snakes. As he lay dying in 1878, the palace was less a place of mourning and more a high-stakes episode of royal family feud. Mindon Min had dozens of wives, concubines, and enough sons to fill an army, or at least a very chaotic family tree. So when word got out that the king was on his last breath, the scheming began before the man had finished coughing. Rooms that should have been filled with incense and prayers were instead buzzing with plotting. Which son would take over? Which wife would be queen mother? Who could bribe the most guards before the last rites? Mindon Min died quietly of illness in the middle of what was essentially a living Game of Thrones episode. The moment he passed, the palace erupted in chaos, with brothers turning on brothers, alliances, shifting mid-eulogy, and one especially ambitious son, Thebal, seizing the throne like a royal Black Friday shopper. It was the kind of royal death where the corpse was barely cold before his relatives started dividing the furniture. And if you think that's undignified, wait until you meet the emperor who fled the capital, botched his own suicide, and begged a servant to finish the job. Emperor Nero of Rome, 68 AD. When it comes to history's most dramatic exits, Emperor Nero wrote the playbook and then cried through the final act. After years of theatrical tyranny, setting things on fire, including allegedly parts of Rome, and turning the empire into his personal opera, Nero finally pushed everyone too far. The Senate declared him an enemy of the state. His guards abandoned him, and the empire basically said, "We're done." So what did Nero do? He fled Rome, disguised as a servant, wearing a tunic far beneath his usual sequins and lyre aesthetic. Hiding in the countryside, he realized the jig was up. With imperial forces closing in, he decided to take his own life, Roman style, by falling on his sword. One problem: he couldn't go through with it. He panicked. He trembled. He wept. And in a final moment of anti-glory, he turned to his personal secretary and begged, "Please, do it for me." The poor man obliged, and Nero finally died, not as a warrior, not as a hero, but as the world's most melodramatic boss in a death scene he couldn't finish himself. His last words: "What an artist dies in me." Because of course they were. Still, Nero's ending was classic theatre, but for pure cinematic style, no one beats the original queen of drama, Cleopatra, Queen Cleopatra, 30 BC. Cleopatra knew how to make an entrance, and more importantly, she knew how to make an exit. As Octavian's forces closed in on Alexandria, she refused to be paraded through Rome in chains, so she chose death. The legend says she summoned an asp, yes, a venomous snake, concealed in a basket of figs. She let it bite her arm, gave her maidens a matching farewell, and died reclining regally in her robes. Cue tragic music, fluttering curtains, and the sound of centuries of historians arguing. Because here's the twist: the snake story might be total nonsense. Modern scholars suggest it was actually poison hidden in a hairpin. Less Shakespearean, more spy thriller. Either way, she took her fate into her own hands, made sure her death would be talked about for millennia, and turned herself into a tragic icon in the process. No one dies like Cleopatra. It was calculated, it was symbolic, and it made sure that when Rome finally kicked in the door, they found nothing but a crown, a snake, or a lie, and a very powerful final act. But if snake bites and daggers feel a little too glamorous, don't worry. Our next royal was taken out by the deadliest of medieval hazards, poorly supervised hunting trips, King William II of England, 1100. Known as William Rufus for his red hair and temper, this son of William the Conqueror had the misfortune of being one of England's least liked monarchs, and he died in a way that only deepened the mystery and the awkwardness. One sunny day in 1100, William went out hunting in the New Forest with a group of noblemen. Among them, Sir Walter Tyrrell, a man whose name would go down in legend, and possibly on a wanted poster. At some point during the hunt, an arrow accidentally flew through the air and struck the king square in the chest. William dropped dead on the spot. Tyrrell? He did what any completely innocent man would do. He fled the scene at full gallop and didn't stop until he was safely out of the country. Suspicious? Just a bit. There were no investigations, no arrests. The body was left lying in the forest for hours until someone finally remembered to fetch it. Meanwhile, William's younger brother Henry just happened to be nearby and just happened to rush off and seize the crown before the body was even cold. Officially, it was a hunting accident. Unofficially, the most convenient case of royal oops in medieval history. A king slain, a crown claimed, and a deer that probably escaped unharmed. But if you think that was a suspicious ending, wait until we discuss the king who died with rumours of a red-hot poker swirling around his legacy. And his anatomy, King Edward II of England, 1327. Edward II wasn't exactly England's most celebrated king. More interested in his male favourites than running the country, and more likely to start a civil war than a tax reform, Edward ruffled more feathers than a fox in a henhouse. Eventually, even his own wife, Queen Isabella, nicknamed the She-Wolf of France, got tired of his antics and teamed up with her lover, Roger Mortimer, to invade England and kick Edward off the throne. He was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle, and their things got messy. Enter the red-hot poker story. According to some chroniclers, Edward's assassins wanted to kill him in a way that wouldn't leave a visible mark. So, naturally, they settled on the medieval equivalent of ultimate internal sabotage. A red-hot iron poker inserted into a place no poker should ever go. The method was chosen, allegedly, to humiliate as well as destroy. That's right. England's ex-king may have been murdered via weaponized fire enema. Now, historians today debate whether this really happened. It might be propaganda, it might be myth, or it might be one of those moments when truth is stranger and more uncomfortable than fiction. Either way, the image stuck. Edward's legacy is forever linked to the most awkward assassination in royal history. But at least his death was quiet. Emperor Johannes IV, on the other hand, died with bullets flying and generals shouting over his bleeding body. Emperor Johannes IV of Ethiopia, 1889. Johannes IV was a warrior king, plain and simple. He spent most of his reign unifying Ethiopia, fending off the Egyptians, battling the Mahdists, and casually wrestling with colonial ambitions from Europeans who didn't know when to quit. But in 1889, during the Battle of Galabat, fate caught up with him, in the form of a well-aimed Mahdist bullet. Shot in the chest, Johannes didn't die immediately. No, he did it the royal way, bleeding out dramatically on the battlefield while his top commanders stood nearby arguing about what to do next. Retreat? Counterattack? Maybe draw straws? Meanwhile, the emperor lay dying, quite possibly thinking, if you'd spent less time bickering and more time helping, I might still be alive. By the time his generals made up their minds, Johannes was dead, his body later captured and paraded around by his enemies. His death threw the empire into chaos and set the stage for a succession crisis. Nothing says we failed the king like letting him expire while squabbling over strategy, as if they were in a particularly tense game of Risk. At least Johannes died in war. The same can't be said for our next royal genius, who got himself murdered because he thought sharing his wife's nudity was a quirky bonding activity. King Condolis of Lydia, 7th century BC. You know that old phrase, don't show your friends your naked wife? No, that's probably because King Condolis of Lydia didn't hear it in time. Condolis was so proud of his queen's beauty that he insisted on showing her off, without her consent. Convinced she was the most beautiful woman alive, he devised a deeply stupid plan. He told his bodyguard Gyges to hide behind a curtain and spy on her while she undressed. Yes, this was the king's big idea. And no, it did not end well. The queen noticed, and she was not amused. Rather than quietly divorcing her boundary-challenged husband, she confronted Gyges the next day with a proposition. Kill the king, take the throne, and marry her, or die for being a pervert. Gyges, unsurprisingly, chose regicide. He stabbed condoles in his sleep and became king himself, presumably avoiding curtain-based espionage for the rest of his reign. Candoles's death was avoidable, embarrassing, and entirely his own fault. Let this be a lesson. If you treat your queen like a museum exhibit, don't be surprised when the security system turns against you. And if you think that was royal madness, just wait for the Sultan who was so unstable, he drowned hundreds of concubines, and was still shocked when he got strangled with a silk cord. Sultan Ibrahim of the Ottoman Empire, 1648. If ever a sultan earned the nickname Ibrahim the Mad, it was, well, Ibrahim. This 17th century Ottoman ruler was a royal chaos machine, wrapped in silk and crowned in instability. From the moment he inherited the throne, after spending his youth locked in a windowless cage, literally, things went off the rails and stayed there. Among his greatest hits, lavish spending sprees that nearly bankrupted the empire, obsessive paranoia that everyone was plotting against him, they kind of were, and a curious habit of throwing gold coins into the Bosphorus to feed the fish. Not metaphorically, literally. Because clearly, nothing says fiscal responsibility like enriching the seafood. But his most infamous moment came when he was gripped by the irrational belief that the women of his harem were plotting his downfall. So he ordered the execution of 280 concubines, drowning them all in the palace's harbour. It was a bloodbath of pure royal delusion, and even the Ottoman court, which had already seen centuries of drama, blinked in stunned horror. Eventually, everyone had enough. The clergy, military, and even his mother came together in rare, desperate unity. Ibrahim was deposed and later strangled with a bowstring, Ottoman tradition, elegant in its own dark way. It was the kind of quiet yet pointed execution that said, "Thanks for your service, but also, never again." And yet, even he managed to have palace guards. Unlike our next royal, who thought walking through a war zone unguarded was just good cardio. King George I of Greece, 1913. You'd think being king during a war would make you slightly cautious about things like being outside. Not King George I of Greece. In 1913, during the First Balkan War, George went for a stroll in Thessaloniki, alone. No bodyguards, no entourage. Just a royal hat and the kind of confidence only a man with absolutely no self-preservation instinct could muster. Enter Alexandros Shinas, a disgruntled anarchist with a pistol and opinions. He approached the king, exchanged a few words, which George reportedly didn't understand. Shinas spoke in French or maybe Greek, and the king responded in baffled Danish, and then promptly shot him in the back. George dropped dead in the street, less than a month before his 50th anniversary on the throne. The tragedy. This was a man who had survived assassination attempts, palace plots, and revolutions. But in the end, it was a lonely walk in a war zone that did him in. His guards had been dismissed for the day. No state procession. Just a king with bad timing and worse linguistic reflexes. At least he went out during a conflict. King Stephen of England? He died of a tummy ache. King Stephen of England, 1154. After nearly 2 decades of civil war known as the Anarchy, you'd expect King Stephen to die in battle, felled by a rival or betrayed in court. But no. Stephen's long, bruising reign, marked by shifting allegiances, castle sieges, and enough double-crossing to fill a soap opera, ended with a whimper and some serious gastrointestinal distress. The official story, he died of a stomachache, possibly from a combination of old age, stress, and medieval cuisine, which consisted mainly of questionable meat, spoiled fruit, and mead that doubled as antiseptic. No hero's death, no epic final battle. Just the king quietly clutching his gut, and groaning his way into the afterlife. It was the royal equivalent of tripping on your shoelace at the finish line of a marathon. After years of dragging the country through blood-soaked chaos, the kingdom finally got peace, and Stephen got a final bowel betrayal. His death was so unspectacular that most chroniclers wrote it down like they were apologizing. Stephen expired quietly, probably while trying to digest a questionable pie. And with that, we come to the final curtain call. The emperor who spent his last days pretending to be an elephant, biting people, and riding through the palace in a cart. Because why go out quietly when you can go out like a literal circus act? Emperor Justin II of Byzantium, 578 AD. Ruling the Byzantine Empire was never a stress-free job, but Emperor Justin II's descent into full theatrical madness still managed to raise the imperial bar for bizarre. At first, Justin tried to follow in the sensible footsteps of his uncle Justinian the Great, but unlike Justinian, who built empires and basilicas, Justin II's reign slowly unraveled into the most bewildering mental breakdown in the history of Eastern Rome. As pressures from invading Persians and crumbling alliances mounted, Justin lost his grip, first politically, then psychologically, then very, very audibly. He began by screaming at furniture. Not about the furniture, at it, as if the throne was heckling him and the curtains were staging a revolt. Next came the people biting. Court members reported that the emperor would lunge, teeth first, at anyone within chomping range, diplomats, aides, possibly upholstery. In the absence of actual wars, he launched a dental campaign. Eventually, he was deemed unfit to rule, and his courtiers, bless them, came up with a plan to keep him entertained and contained. They had him wheeled through the palace in a special cart where he could pretend to be an elephant. Yes, he made trumpet noises, flapped imaginary ears, and charged down the marble corridors of Constantinople like a tusked monarch in a royal reenactment of Dumbo, the autocracy edition. Rather than remove him entirely, the court appointed a co-emperor and let Justin live out his remaining days in full circus mode. It was tragic, yes, but also the sort of death by decline that leaves historians half sobbing, half snorting. But if you thought being carted around making elephant noises was a strange farewell, the final entry in our royal parade is perhaps the most absurdly modern. A king cut down mid-cornflakes. King Faisal II of Iraq, 1958. King Faisal II was young, stylish, and possibly the last person in history to believe breakfast was safe for monarchs. In 1958, just 19 years old and ruling a kingdom teetering on the edge of collapse, Faisal woke up to what should have been a normal summer morning in Baghdad. The air was hot, the palace was quiet, and his breakfast had just been served. Then came the coup. Revolutionary forces stormed the royal residence. Faisal, still in his pajamas, barely had time to react. He was captured alongside members of the royal family and marched out into the courtyard. When asked for his last words, he reportedly said, "Wait, I haven't finished my breakfast." The soldiers, unimpressed by his culinary priorities, opened fire. Cereal interrupted by bullets. A monarchy ended by a missed mouthful. The image is haunting and weirdly mundane. A king not felled in battle, nor betrayed in court, but while trying to finish a bowl of probably soggy cornflakes. And just like that, the Hashemite dynasty in Iraq ended with a breakfast cut short, a monarchy overthrown, and history's final reminder. In the long, tragic, often ridiculous saga of royal deaths, dignity is optional, but timing is everything.